Welcome to Getting to Know UBC. We're kind of doing a routine of first. So this will be our first Getting to Know UBC, actually partly done on the campus of Oklahoma Baptist University and partly done from my house. Both of those locations have never been done before, never been featured before on Getting to Know UBC. Our guest today is, for some of you, obviously, for some of you, maybe not obviously, but our guest today is Corey Fuller. Hi, Corey.
Hello.
Hey, Corey, why don't you tell people why you're on the campus of Oklahoma Baptist University, what your connection is to that?
Okay, so the short answer is we're in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, and so I'm up here working on some files and some lectures to distribute to my students in the midst of this pandemic. So we moved to an all online format for the rest of the year, and so that's created all kinds of anxieties for a lot of different people. And I think the teachers are probably more anxious than the students. But I guess the fuller answer, no pun intended, of why I'm here is I've been a teacher at OBU for the last 11 years. I'm in my 11th year. So I started in 2009, and I teach graphic design in the Division of Art and Design at OBU.
Okay. Mm-hmm. But as I know, and other people might not know, your actual connection or association with Shawnee goes back before 2009
right.
At OBU. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that connection and your experience with the community? One of the things I really appreciate about UBC is that we're just not addressed in Shawnee, but we're connected to the community of Shawnee. So why don't you talk a little bit about your earliest connections to this town?
Okay, so my grandparents lived in Shawnee for several years. So my grandfather was a pastor in Tulsa and several other rural areas in eastern Oklahoma. And then they sort of retired in Shawnee, though he was the type that never truly retired. He continued to pastor churches and meet with people and do what he had always done in retirement. And so I spent a lot of Thanksgivings and Christmases in Shawnee just visiting with them. And then I had some cousins that went to OBU. My Uncle Rusty's 4 children all attended OBU. So I was really familiar with the campus and the community from an early age, I guess you could say.
Okay. Well, and interestingly enough, my connections with Shawnee obviously started as a student, and I was a student with 3 out of the 4 of your cousins that you just mentioned.
Small world.
It is a small world. So let's talk about connection to UBC. And you and I have an interesting mutual connection to UBC presently, but have some past connections as well. So talk about, I'm assuming your connection to UBC started with your time at OBU and not before with your grandparents.
Right, yes. Yeah, I think my grandparents attended First Baptist, but I never went to church with them at that time. So, well, let me think about this. So connections to UBC. So when we first started like moving to Shawnee, we didn't really have a church home, obviously. And like our church background, like in our early married years, was kind of odd. Like it just felt like we were never going to settle in. And so we tried like 3 different churches. And I think we also knew we would never live in Edmond or Oklahoma City long term. And so it made it kind of hard to like connect. And so when we moved to Shawnee and made that decision, I really wanted to find a stable church, you know, one that had probably been around for a while. And we had good church experiences, but it was like a different chapter. You know, we knew we would have young kids probably growing up in this church, and we wanted to put down roots. And so we wanted to find a really good, stable church home, something that was hopefully like intergenerational. And so when we first moved here, we were part of a house church with some friends that we met. We did that for a semester. And then I met Louis Malalit through OBU, and he was music minister at UBC at the time. So he was a connection. We also met the Cranes. So Canyon Crane, who teaches at OBU, and his wife Stephanie. And they had kids that were, I guess they just had one kid. We just had one kid at the time, but they were a big connection with us to UBC. And yeah, it's been a great experience. We've made a lot of mutual connections over the years since you coached my kids' soccer team.
Right.
You coached Carly's soccer team before you were even the pastor,
That's
um,
true.
which was really interesting to have that sort of connection. So yeah, when we started at UBC, Bob Searle was here, and then Steve Dominy, and then Justin. And so I had the pleasure of serving on your pastor search committee, which I'm really glad that worked out. So
As am I. What was it like? What was it like being a member, kind of have a mutual connection that got you into the community at UBC, and then you served on the worship team for for many years, I assume, and then have served in different capacities, but then to serve in that capacity as chairperson of the pastor search committee, which is an interesting position, in lots of different ways.
yeah.
What did you feel like? How did your connection deepen to the point where you felt comfortable and felt called to serve in that position? And then how did serving in that position, what did that do to your connection to the UBC community?
Yeah. So when you're without a pastor, and I mean, I've grown up in Baptist churches my whole life, and so it's always really interesting to see what happens because you sort of have a vacuum of leadership, and sometimes you have people that try to come in and fill that space, sometimes good and sometimes bad.
Right.
Um, but I guess I've gotten to see UBC a couple of times in the interim. There's some really good organic leadership that just happens like in those interim times. So it's actually, I mean, fairly healthy. And both of our previous pastors have left the church in like a really good position. So it was never like a situation of like, oh, we're dealing with like a financial woe
Right.
or scandal or something like some churches deal with. So it was, I mean, a really healthy, organic process to serve, on the pastor search committee. We had 5 really great representatives of the church. Any of them would have made a wonderful chairperson. You definitely have to pray through a lot of things, and you have to kind of get a sense of the pulse of the church, and they're looking for, and also who God would have. And I don't know if you were going to get into this, but Brent Newsom, of course, that was chair of the deacons at that time, who was your roommate at OBU.
It's true.
So you were one of our first applicants. Of course, we fielded a lot of applicants from a lot of different places, but we were glad to have stumbled upon you. And like I said, I'm glad it worked out.
Well, yeah, that's and to be more precise, because Brent would want me to point this out, that we were roommates for one semester, our very first semester, but obviously maintained a friendship through those times. What you do at OBU and what you teach is one of those really interesting things that comes out of both a talent and a talent to do something, and then a calling to help others do it as well, and maybe further an ability they've already had, or show them an ability they didn't know they had yet. I would guess that you get students that come to you that have never done graphic design before, and just kind of think it sounds interesting, or maybe take it as an elective, and then kind of latch onto it. What is it like? Because I know what this is like as a pastor and a teaching in that way, but what is it like in your profession and in your specific area of your profession to see a student come in that may have raw talent, or that may have little or no interest in the area of graphic design, and just to see that kind of flourish and come together? Can you think of does that make you think of a specific student, or what is that like to connect those dots for someone else?
Right. So something I do as a professor that I didn't really anticipate doing as much of this sort of thing as I do now is sort of counseling with them and trying to determine what their calling is. And so, sometimes it's a matter of of people not being successful academically, like in another discipline.
Right.
So, graphic design, that sounds easy, so but sometimes they come over that way, and then they find out it's not easy, It's just a different way of problem solving. Um, but sometimes I'll have students that are majoring in ministry or something, and they decide through taking some of my classes and my colleagues' classes that they want to major in graphic design or art. And I'm always like a little hesitant on that because I call that stealing from Jesus. Like if I take a ministry major and I make that person, which has happened before, I make that person a graphic design major. But hopefully they can still like pursue their calling to share the gospel even through this vehicle of graphic design. So it does happen. I mean, when you think about your life from 18 to 22, which is kind of the general population we have here at OBU, that's a very transformational, very formative time. So when I counsel with students, it's actually, I mean, kind of scary in some ways because the things I'm saying and the questions I'm asking could like not dictate, but in a lot of ways inform the trajectory that they're going to pursue for the rest of their life.
Right.
And so that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
But I always try to make sure that it's done in conjunction with what their giftedness is, what they sense they're calling to be, that they're talking to their parents, that they're praying to these things. But I mean, I see graphic designer art as being a form of a calling. It's just a different way of pursuing it than say like vocational ministry would be.
Yeah. For you, and this has kind of become in the last 2, and now this being 3, getting to know UBCs that we've done, this has kind of become the golden egg question. One of my favorite quotes is Frederick Buechner, who says that God's will for your life and the idea of calling is when your deep gladness and the world's deep sadness meet. The idea that God gives us a joy, and he gives us that joy not for self-serving purposes, but for the purposes of meeting the needs of others. So assuming, hopefully, that graphic design is a joy for you, maybe some aspects of it more than other. I don't pretend to know all the ins and outs of graphic design. I've learned more being your friend than I would have ever known. But where does the joy of graphic design for you, how have you seen it meet the deep sadness that's in the world?
Right. So just to give you a little bit of background. So I went to college at Southwestern Oklahoma State University, met my wife there. For various reasons, I wasn't like real happy about the graphic design program when I was there. It experienced a lot of turnover and other things. Ultimately, it was a good experience, but I really thought about transferring out to another school. But I had met Kara, and I was really put into the BCM. And so, like, for my life when I was in college, graphic design wasn't like terribly important to me,
Right.
which is kind of odd since it was my major. I mean, I did it. I always kind of thought I would go into a ministry of some kind. And so my junior year, I got a chance to serve as a youth minister, and I thought I would be really good at that.
Your dad was a youth minister, right?
Yeah. So in my arrogance, I thought I would be really good at that because I'd watched my dad do it, and he was kind of a rock star youth minister for a lot of years in Oklahoma. And so I saw someone do that well, and so when you see someone do something well, it makes it look easy, even though it's not easy. So I had students that had a lot of needs and a lot of real problems that I wasn't quite prepared to face. So I kind of went through when that experience didn't go well. I kind of went through a crisis of identity and vocation and calling, and I had sensed a call to ministry, and I just didn't know what to do with it. I didn't really want to be a pastor. Didn't feel like I was equipped or capable of that. And so I thought, well, I'll go to grad school because that's what you do when you don't know what to do. Dump more money into education. So, but through that experience, I got a chance to teach at UCO, where I went to grad school, and I would say minister. I mean, that's a state school, but I really felt like I was able to mentor a lot of students during my time there, and I'm glad that experience went well because that's what really guided me into this new thinking that okay, I can minister to people and I can teach kind of at the same time. And I also believe that design can be used to solve problems. Now, we're not healing people like in the way that a nurse or a doctor would heal people, but you're bringing clarity to situations. It's a form of problem solving, which I think I've already said. And one of the best definitions for a designer that I've heard is someone who brings order to chaos.
Hmm.
We live in a chaotic world. We live in chaotic times. And so designers can help bring order and peace to those situations. Go ahead. Do you have a question? Sorry.
Well, I was going to ask, there's a particular kind of design that you do, and that from observation point, you seem pretty passionate about, that has to do with letter printing.
With letterpress?
Letterpress, yeah. I don't know what that is. People
Yeah.
listening to this may be well acquainted and know every part of it. But tell me about how letterpress, give me an example from letterpress, bringing clarity and showing those things.
Okay, so letterpress goes all the way back to the time of Gutenberg, and so Gutenberg is the one that's credited with inventing movable type, and so he created the 42-line Bible, which probably in large part created the Protestant Reformation. And so once you have the ability to print and mass produce a text, you have a demand from people wanting to be able to read that text. So literacy is going to go up as people begin to read, they begin to think, and form their own opinions, obviously. And so, I mean, anytime you have literacy entered into the equation, you're going to have some kind of cultural revolution. And so letterpress was the way that printing was done for a very, very long time, taking little, pieces of type and putting them in a chase and inking them and putting them onto paper. That's how messages were disseminated. There were some other innovations that really probably aren't worth talking about right now, but now we're not in the movable type revolution, we're in the digital revolution.
Right.
A lot of what we're doing now is, we're designing websites, we're designing interactive experiences. And we're in a revolution right now. It may not feel like it because we're fish in water and we're living in it, but we are certainly in a revolution right now.
Okay. Wow. That's interesting stuff. It's just stuff that it's worlds that I don't swim in, to pick up on your fish analogy. It is interesting to me, you credit Gutenberg's contributions to the Protestant Reformation, and those are irrefutable. But from a almost advertising side, advertising aspect of what you're dealing with as well, it just seems to me that Lutheranism rolls off the tongue a lot better than Gutenbergianism.
Yeah.
So maybe he was just a victim of a long last name.
Maybe he was. Yeah. The thing about Gutenberg, he would print anything for anybody, though. So he would print a Protestant pamphlet. He would print indulgences for the Catholic Church. I mean, he would print anything.
Okay.
He was a businessman more than a theologian, I think.
Yeah. That gets us into a level of conversation, businessman versus theologian, that probably makes us more uncomfortable than we're willing to deal with at this point.
Right. One thing I will say about that, so one of the obvious avenues for a designer is to go into advertising.
Okay.
That creates a bit of a problem, because if we're creating more advertising and more advertising and more advertising, we're actually creating more chaos.
Yeah.
Designers are supposed to bring order to the chaos. So that's one of the things I present as kind of a paradox, I guess, if you will, in my courses, that we're supposed to be solving problems, but sometimes if we only advertise, we're trying to pull people in all these different directions, or maybe kind of undoing what our call is, in order to things. If that makes sense.
No, it makes great sense. And do you think for you, part of the reason that there's the pull of design is that feeling of your own, we're not going to put you on a couch or anything, but that feeling of your own personal chaos? Or just, I'm interested on kind of, as we close this out, how you see chaos and how design kind of pulls you down or gears you down in order to be able to confront that chaos.
Right. So for a while, I was affiliated with a group called International Arts Movement, which was started by Mako Fujimura, and he has a lot of interesting things to say. and has written a lot of great things on the relationship of art to culture and design to culture. But one of the buzzwords he always uses, and you hear this buzzword from all of people that have been affiliated with Tim Keller at any level, is creating the world that ought to be. And I think that's what we're trying to do. So as Christians, we see the world, we see beauty in the world, we see peace in the world, but it's still not as it ought to be. So I think artists are called to be change agents within the culture, which doesn't mean you're just like throwing stones at the culture saying this is bad, this is sinful, but you're hopefully providing some sort of alternative to the sin that's in the world. It's not just condemning things. You're providing a sense of positive culture.
Corey, thank you so much for your time. It's really interesting stuff, and thank you for what you bring to UBC. I hope you have a great day.
Thanks, Justin. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you.
See ya. See you when I learn how to stop recording.